Right now, at this exact moment, a military encirclement is tightening across West Africa, and nobody's talking about it. Chad just moved thousands of troops to Burkina Faso's borders in what looks like a calculated military chokehold. But here's what changes everything. The man leading Burkina Faso isn't backing down. Captain Ibrahim Traoré just made a move that blindsided regional analysts, triggering a chain reaction that's now pulling Mali and Niger into a dangerous alliance that could either prevent war or spark the Sahel's biggest conflict in a decade. What he did next shocked everyone watching. One African military leader just made a move that could reshape the entire Sahel region, and the international powers watching from the shadows are scrambling to understand what comes next. In the span of weeks, military buildups have transformed a geopolitical question mark into a full-blown regional crisis that nobody saw coming, and the implications stretch far beyond West Africa's borders. Welcome to the story of how a single strategic decision triggered a cascade of military mobilizations that could either stabilize the Sahel or plunge it into open conflict. This is the documentary-style breakdown of what's actually happening on the ground, why it matters, and what it reveals about the future of African geopolitics in the 2020s. To understand this moment, you first need to understand the landscape we're talking about. The Sahel, that vast semi-arid region that stretches across the breadth of Africa from Mauritania in the west to Sudan in the east, has become ground zero for competing interests, shifting alliances, and military tensions that rival anything we've seen in decades. It's a region where French colonial legacies still linger, where American strategic interests intersect with Russian ambitions, and where African nations are increasingly asserting their own sovereignty in ways that challenge the traditional power structure. But here's what makes this moment different from the dozens of regional tensions that have simmered across Africa over the past 2 decades. This isn't just about border disputes or resource competition. What's unfolding right now in the Sahel involves calculated military positioning, high-stakes diplomatic maneuvering, and a fundamental recalibration of who holds power in West Africa. And it all hinges on one man's decisions and one country's strategic response. Chad, positioned to the east of Burkina Faso, is reportedly moving significant military forces near Burkina Faso's eastern border. On the surface, this might sound like routine military repositioning, but analysts watching the region closely understand that this is anything but routine. The movement of military assets at this scale, in this specific location, at this specific moment in time, carries unmistakable strategic intent. According to regional reports and intelligence assessments, Chad's military mobilization appears designed to pressure Burkina Faso from the east, while potentially creating an encirclement strategy, a classic military tactic where opposing forces are hemmed in from multiple directions, limiting their options and forcing them into a strategically disadvantageous position. But here's where the story becomes genuinely fascinating. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso's military leader who consolidated power through a coup in 2022, didn't panic. He didn't retreat. Instead, he did something far more strategically sophisticated. He responded with his own calculated moves that transformed what could have been a Chadian advantage into a regional standoff that now involves Mali and Niger directly in Burkina Faso's security architecture. Traoré's response reveals something crucial about the current balance of power in the Sahel. Rather than viewing himself as isolated or vulnerable, he recognized something that many outside observers initially missed. He had allies, and those allies had just as much interest in preventing a Chadian-led encirclement as he did. So Burkina Faso began coordinating intensively with Mali and Niger, 2 neighboring nations that share borders with Chad and have their own complex relationships with Burkinabe leadership. This coordination wasn't accidental. It represents a formal recognition that in the modern Sahel, security cannot be viewed in isolation. What happens on Burkina Faso's eastern border affects Mali's strategic position to the north. What happens in Niger impacts the broader stability of the entire region. And what happens when 3 military-led governments coordinate their defenses sends a message that reverberates across Africa's geopolitical landscape. These 3 nations, each having experienced military coups and transitions to military rule, now appear to be moving toward a unified security posture. But that's not the full story. And understanding what's really happening requires us to zoom out and see the larger chessboard on which these moves are being made. The military tension between Chad and Burkina Faso doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's the visible manifestation of much deeper regional dynamics that involve everything from resource control to ideological positioning to the fundamental question of whether African nations can chart their own course or whether they'll remain trapped in the orbit of external powers. To understand Chad's apparent aggressive posturing, you need to know something about Chad's own internal situation. Chad, under President Mahamat Idriss Déby, has been navigating its own complex transition from military rule. Déby took power in 2021 following his father's death, and his consolidation of power has involved both internal consolidation and external maneuvering. Some analysts suggest that Déby's military movements toward Burkina Faso might be designed to achieve multiple objectives simultaneously: to enhance Chad's strategic position in the region, to project strength domestically, and to establish Chad as a key player in any future security architecture for the Sahel. The irony here is compelling. Both Chad and Burkina Faso have military governments. Both nations have experienced their own internal instability. Both countries are dealing with insurgencies, economic challenges, and questions about legitimacy. Yet rather than finding common ground or collaborating on shared security challenges, they're moving toward confrontation. What does this tell us about the state of African leadership in 2024? What does it reveal about how military governments view regional competition? Here's where things get genuinely interesting from a geopolitical perspective. The security situation in Burkina Faso is dire. The nation faces an ongoing insurgency from multiple militant groups, including Al-Qaeda affiliates and ISIS-linked organizations. The violence has displaced millions of people and created a humanitarian crisis of staggering proportions. In this context, Traoré's response to Chad's military mobilization makes strategic sense. He cannot afford to have his military stretched across multiple fronts. If Chad is pressuring him from the east, while his forces are heavily committed to fighting insurgents in the north and west, Burkina Faso's security position becomes untenable. By coordinating with Mali and Niger, Traoré essentially created a multiplier effect. Mali can provide support on the northwestern border. Niger can provide support on the northeastern border and potentially the eastern approaches. This network of military coordination, informal as it may be, creates the appearance and potentially the reality of a unified defensive posture that makes unilateral action by Chad significantly riskier. It's deterrence through alliance, a classic principle of international relations, executed in the Sahel's contemporary context. But here's what makes this moment so significant and so uncertain. These three nations and Chad represent a broader realignment happening across Africa. For decades, the Sahel's security architecture was heavily influenced by France, which maintained military bases across the region, conducted counter-terrorism operations, and served as an external guarantor of security. France's influence was so dominant that smaller nations often couldn't make major security decisions without considering French preferences and capabilities. That arrangement is breaking down. Over the past 3 years, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger have all requested the withdrawal of French military forces. Mali and Burkina Faso have turned toward Russia and other external partners. This represents a seismic shift in how African nations are asserting their sovereignty. They're saying, in effect, that they want to determine their own security futures. But here's the complication. Asserting sovereignty in one direction often means becoming more vulnerable in another. When you ask a traditional security partner to leave, you need alternatives. When you lack those alternatives, you become more exposed to pressure from regional adversaries. Chad's military positioning can be understood partly through this lens. With French influence declining, and with uncertainty about what the new security architecture in the Sahel will look like, some regional actors might be attempting to establish fait accompli arrangements to grab territorial or strategic advantage before new alignments solidify. If Chad can demonstrate military superiority on its western border with Burkina Faso, it might be able to shape whatever new security arrangements emerge in the region. The coordination between Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger represents a counter to this strategy. Rather than allowing Chad to dictate terms through military positioning, these three nations are saying, "We will coordinate our defenses, we will present a unified front, and we will not accept pressure that attempts to shift power distributions in the region." This is a form of regional assertion that doesn't require external great powers. It's African nations using their own resources, geography, and diplomatic positioning to shape outcomes. But what makes this situation so volatile is the presence of external actors with their own interests in the outcome. Russia has positioned itself as a security partner to these nations, particularly Mali and Burkina Faso. The United States maintains a military presence in Niger and has regional intelligence operations. France, despite being asked to leave, retains enormous influence through historical ties, language, and institutional relationships. And there are other players in the background. Gulf states interested in counterterrorism and regional influence, European nations concerned about instability that could trigger migration flows, and African regional organizations attempting to mediate. What happened next changed everything about how regional analysts viewed the stability of the Sahel. The military mobilization that began as Chad's strategic gambit transformed into a regional test of whether West African nations could act collectively without external powers calling the shots. The response from Burkina Faso and its allies suggested they were intent on passing that test. But the intensification of military positioning also suggested that the risk of miscalculation had increased substantially. Think about the mechanisms that prevent regional conflicts from spiraling into open warfare. Typically, they involve clear communication between parties, established protocols for de-escalation, and mutual understanding of red lines. In the Sahel, these mechanisms are underdeveloped. Military governments operating with limited institutional constraints can make rapid decisions. In the absence of clear communication channels, military movements designed as deterrents can be misinterpreted as preparations for attack. The risk of accidental escalation increases exponentially. There's also the question of what external powers might do if regional conflict begins. Russia's presence as a security partner to some of these nations creates complicated dynamics. If Burkina Faso and Mali face military pressure from Chad, does Russia offer military support? Does it mediate? Does it see advantage in regional conflict? The United States and France have their own interests in preventing major conflict in the region, but those interests might not always align. France might want to preserve regional stability to maintain influence. The U.S. might want to limit Russian expansion, which could theoretically involve preventing Russian allies from being defeated or, alternatively, preventing Russian partners from becoming too dominant. These competing interests create a situation where regional tensions could very easily trigger great power positioning. Here's what makes this situation truly captivating from a geopolitical perspective. It represents a fundamental recalibration of how African nations relate to each other and to the international system. For decades, the default assumption was that African nations were essentially reactive entities, responding to external pressures and opportunities. The Sahel's current military alignments suggest something different. They suggest that African nations, even weak and conflict-ridden ones, are capable of strategic thinking, alliance building, and coordinated action on behalf of their perceived interests. Burkina Faso under Traoré, despite facing an enormous security challenge from insurgent groups, has managed to consolidate enough power and build sufficient regional relationships to resist external pressure from Chad. That's not a small accomplishment. It demonstrates that military governments, for all their faults, can be surprisingly effective at the specific task of military coordination and deterrence. Whether they can be effective at the broader tasks of governance, development, and inclusive political systems is a separate question, but it's not the question being tested right now. The military positioning we're seeing also reveals something about how the insurgency problem in the Sahel intersects with international security concerns. The United States is deeply concerned about terrorism in the Sahel. European nations are concerned about the same threat because it can create instability that triggers migration flows toward Europe. But individual Sahel governments, particularly those in Burkina Faso and Mali, may view the insurgency problem through a different lens. They may see it partly as a legitimate security threat and partly as a backdrop against which they can increase military capabilities, consolidate power, and resist external pressure. These different framings of the same underlying problem can create contradictions where external partners are funding and training military forces that are simultaneously becoming less willing to take external direction. What makes Chad's apparent military mobilization strategy so significant is that it challenges this emerging assertion of autonomy. If Chad can successfully pressure Burkina Faso, it might demonstrate that the new African-centric approach to regional security is vulnerable to pressure from determined adversaries. If Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger can successfully deter Chad through coordinated positioning, they establish a precedent that African nations can protect their interests through regional cooperation without external guarantees. The stakes of this outcome extend far beyond the specific bilateral relationship between Chad and Burkina Faso. They involve questions about whether Africa's security future will be organized through external arrangements with Western or Russian powers, or through regional mechanisms and African-driven solutions. They involve questions about whether military-led governments can effectively govern and provide security to their populations. They involve questions about whether the Sahel can achieve stability or whether it will remain trapped in cycles of insurgency, state fragility, and military competition. There's also the economic dimension to consider. The Sahel possesses significant natural resources: gold, uranium, phosphates, and agricultural potential. Control over territory can mean control over resources, or at minimum, control over whether those resources are developed and who captures the benefits. Military positioning between Chad and Burkina Faso, while presented in security terms, is simultaneously about resource positioning and economic advantage. If Chad can establish strategic dominance, it might improve its ability to influence resource development in border regions or to extract concessions from Burkina Faso regarding resource-sharing arrangements. But here's what often gets overlooked in geopolitical analysis. The actual populations living in these border regions and affected by military positioning don't necessarily benefit from any of these strategic arrangements. Communities along the Chad-Burkina Faso border are likely already experiencing security challenges from insurgent groups. The addition of interstate military tensions to that existing security environment only increases their vulnerability. They're caught between the threat from non-state actors and the positioning of state militaries. In the worst-case scenario, they end up as collateral damage in a conflict between state governments. The humanitarian dimension of this military positioning is significant, but often invisible in strategic analysis. When armies mobilize and position themselves near borders, the affected civilian populations typically suffer. They face restrictions on movement, increased military presence, potential conscription or recruitment pressure, and the specter of conflict. Humanitarian organizations operating in the region face increased access challenges. Development work becomes impossible, and communities that are already fragile from years of insurgent violence become even more vulnerable. Here's where the international response to this situation becomes crucial. Various African organizations, including the African Union and sub-regional bodies, have an interest in preventing military escalation. The African Union, in particular, maintains a commitment to resolving African security challenges through African mechanisms and institutions. If Chad and Burkina Faso's tensions escalate, the African Union is likely to attempt mediation. Success in that mediation would enhance the African Union's credibility as a security organization. Failure would suggest that African institutions remain insufficient to manage regional conflicts, and that external powers would inevitably become involved. The coordination between Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger also has implications for broader African integration. The Economic Community of West African States, known as ECOWAS, is West Africa's primary regional organization. One of ECOWAS's founding commitments is to prevent member states from attacking each other and to mediate conflicts. A serious military escalation between Chad and Burkina Faso, or between Burkina Faso and any of its neighbors, would test ECOWAS's capacity to prevent conflict. Chad is notably not a member of ECOWAS. It's a member of different regional organizations, but Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are all ECOWAS members. This means that any conflict involving Burkina Faso and these allies could create ECOWAS obligations to mediate and potentially to enforce peace. What makes this situation unique in contemporary African geopolitics is the simultaneous operation of multiple security frameworks. Traditional Western security arrangements, bilateral military relationships, NATO-adjacent partnerships, are declining in the Sahel. Russian security partnerships are increasing, particularly in Mali and Burkina Faso. African regional mechanisms, like the African Union, are attempting to increase their relevance and capacity. And bilateral military relationships between African states, like the emerging coordination between Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, are becoming more important. This complex interplay of frameworks creates uncertainty. It's not entirely clear which mechanism will determine outcomes if a serious crisis occurs. That uncertainty itself is destabilizing. When actors don't know which rules apply or which authorities can enforce them, they tend to rely more heavily on military capabilities as the ultimate arbiter of disputes. This creates incentives for military buildups, arms acquisitions, and aggressive positioning. Each side views military strength as the most reliable guarantee of its security because the institutional mechanisms that might provide security guarantees are weak and unpredictable. Chad's military positioning near Burkina Faso should be understood in this context. It's not simply that Devi has decided to challenge Traoré. Rather, Devi, operating in an environment of institutional uncertainty and lacking confidence in mechanisms that might constrain Burkina Faso's behavior, decides that military positioning provides the most reliable way to establish strategic advantage. Conversely, Traoré's coordination with Mali and Niger is partly defensive, addressing the Chad threat, but also partly a hedging strategy in an uncertain environment. If regional institutions can't be relied upon, he'll rely on allies. Here's what makes the next phase of this situation so critical. The decisions made in the coming months will essentially determine whether the Sahel moves toward stability or instability. If Chad and Burkina Faso can find diplomatic off-ramps and de-escalate tensions, it suggests that regional mechanisms can work and that military governments can exercise strategic restraint. If tensions continue to escalate, we could see a regional conflict that forces external powers to choose sides and that disrupts the emerging security architecture that West African nations are attempting to construct. The role of Mali and Niger in this dynamic cannot be overstated. By coordinating with Burkina Faso, they've essentially placed themselves on the opposite side of any potential Chad-Burkina Faso conflict. This creates risks for them. Mali and Niger have their own security challenges from insurgent groups. They have their own territorial disputes and border issues. By taking sides in Burkina Faso's standoff with Chad, they're potentially creating new adversaries and new vulnerabilities. Yet they've made this choice because they apparently view the benefit of regional coordination and mutual support as outweighing the risks of becoming entangled in each other's conflicts. This reveals something profound about how West African military leaders are thinking about their security environments. They're recognizing that their survival and their capacity to exercise power depend partly on regional stability and partly on not being isolated when pressures arise. The alternative to regional coordination is isolation and vulnerability. So even though individual national interest might suggest avoiding entanglement in neighbors' disputes, strategic necessity suggests creating mutual defense arrangements. What happened with these military positionings also raised questions about the role of insurgent groups in the region. The Islamic State in the Greater Sahara, Al-Qaeda's regional affiliates, and various other armed organizations operate across borders and exploit state weakness. Do they benefit from interstate tensions between Chad and Burkina Faso? Quite possibly. If state militaries are distracted by interstate tensions, insurgent groups have more operational space. If military forces are relocated toward borders with other states, they're moved away from areas where they might be combating insurgencies. So while Chad, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are focused on each other's military positioning, the non-state armed groups operating in the region might be strengthening their positions, recruiting, and planning operations. This creates a tragic irony. Military efforts to address state-level security threats through regional coordination might inadvertently strengthen non-state security threats. The resources devoted to military positioning near Chad could instead be devoted to counterinsurgency operations in Burkina Faso's interior. But military leaders, operating in an anarchic international environment without institutions to guarantee their security, often prioritize state-level threats over non-state threats, even when the latter are causing more immediate civilian casualties. Understanding this situation also requires understanding the economic pressures on these governments. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are all lower-income countries with limited government revenues. Their military budgets are constrained, yet they're feeling compelled to invest in military capabilities and positioning. This means resources that might otherwise go to health, education, or economic development are being redirected toward defense. The opportunity costs are substantial. A government that spends more on military positioning is a government that spends less on its citizens' welfare. The external dimension adds another layer of complexity. Russia is providing military equipment, training, and advisory support to Mali and Burkina Faso. This is important because it means that military capabilities in the region are being steadily upgraded. Armed forces that were technologically disadvantaged a few years ago now have access to more advanced equipment. This changes the military balance and might encourage more aggressive posturing because the military capabilities are more credible. It also deepens Russia's strategic interest in how these conflicts unfold, potentially making Russia a stakeholder in escalation or in particular outcomes.